Well, welcome everybody. Good morning. It's a special treat for me to have this opportunity to introduce Torsten Persson, because Torsten and I go back quite a ways. I had my first leave from Princeton in 1982 when I was still a child economist, and I went to Stockholm to the Institute for International Economic Studies, where Torsten was a child economist. And he taught me about eating reindeer and skiing at Åre and other fun things. And we've started a very long continuing friendship. So Torsten is the Swedish Research Council Distinguished Professor at the Institute for International Economic Studies at Stockholm University. He served as director of the IIES for more than 2 decades. He's also played a large number of other service positions to the profession. As many of you know, he's served 2 stints on the Nobel Prize Committee in various roles. He was director of the Program on Institutions, Organizations, and Growth at the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research. He's been the president of the European Economic Association and president of the Econometric Society. Among his many honors, Torsten was awarded the Irja Janssen Medal in 1997 for a young European economist, and then in 2022 he shared the prestigious BBVA Frontiers of Knowledge Award in Economics with Tim Besley and Guido Tabellini. Indeed, along with Tim and Guido, Torsten can be regarded as a founding father of modern political economics. Their work in political economy has really been paradigm changing because they brought to the field the more rigorous discipline and approach of modern macroeconomics, with its focus on intertemporal incentives, policy constraints, commitment problems, information, strategic interactions, and the like, as well as a focus on empirically testable implications. A recurring theme in Torsten's work has been that political institutions matter not only because they determine who governs, but also because they shape the incentives of those that govern. So presidential versus parliamentary systems, majoritarian versus proportional electoral rules, checks and balances, district magnitudes, ballot structures, and like can all affect the size and composition of government spending, not only by who's elected, but also by the incentives they create for the elective politicians. These themes have played out in Torsten's long collaboration with Guido Tabellini that included 2 enormously successful books, and more recently in his work with Tim Besley on state capacity and the coevolution of societal values and political institutions. Today we're going to hear about new work with Tim Besley. In fact, as I just heard, not even written up work, in progress work on the role of new political parties and how they affect and disrupt policy. So, Torsten.
Thank you very much, Jean, for that generous introduction. Thank you for the association for inviting me to speak here, and it's lovely to be here in Belgrade with you all. So, as Jean said, this is new work, not even circulating work with Tim Besley. Let me start with the simple motivation. So, party entry tends to go hand in hand with political change. So perhaps most emphatically, we saw that in the late 19th century when new left parties arose pretty much everywhere, and they soon made economic class a major political cleavage in the political process, competing with liberals and conservatives as the political context permitted. But then things became a little bit more complicated as many countries contemplated social change in the social rights of women in particular and of other groups. And there, the Social Democrats found themselves together with the liberals on that political cleavage. And in fact, in Sweden in the 20s and the 30s, there were alternating coalitions of government, sometimes the Social Democrats with the liberals, sometimes the liberals with the conservatives, and never the Social Democrats alone. So history tends to repeat itself. So, you know, in parallel to those days, we have seen recent political turbulence where a new cleavage, which is not so much based on class, but more on culture, has taken more and more place in the political arena. And then again, party entry has become important, especially in places like Europe with proportional electoral systems, but also elsewhere. Moreover, these new parties again challenge the status quo. So the Greens come on with the slogan of saving the environment, and the radical right want to do many things, but above all, stop migration. And they have started influencing policy in coalitions with sort of the established parties, the center-left or the center-right. So to put this paper in context, you know, how has those political changes affected the scientific literature? In political science and political sociology, a lot. There are whole slews of papers and books on this phenomenon. But in the literature that Jean alluded to, political economics, practiced by economists, has not made so much of an impact, at least in the formalized part. So our standard model still has two parties. They are given, and they compete on a single dimension, which is often an economic dimension. And obviously, this is very different from other economic paradigms with competition between few. Think about growth or IO models where firm entry plays an essential role. So we think one should take at least some first steps to formalize these party dynamics. And what we will try to do is to propose a new setting where policy reflects both new party entry and shifting, endogenously shifting positions of existing parties. And to capture the reality, we like to jointly model both economic conflict and cultural conflict. So the main modeling challenge here is that once you have more than two parties, of course, one single party may not have a majority, then the wonderful world of coalition formation starts. So one has to study both elections and government formation within the same framework, which is one of the reasons that has kept this theory from developing. So what do we do? More concretely, we build a model with two political dimensions. The first one is economic, a conventional left to right axis with some distributive policy. And the second is cultural. You can call it the Galtan axis, so green alternative liberal versus traditional authoritarian and nationalistic, where there are going to be two policies, one on to regulate the environment, so on green issues, and one to regulate immigration, so on nationalist issues. We're going to start with two incumbent mainstream parties and just demonstrate that policies in equilibrium may focus on this economic dimension and basically ignore interest in the Galtan dimension. And then we'll go on and study causes and consequences of entry of either the green or radical right parties. In fact, two forms of entry, but I'll get back to that later. So we'll try to show how shifts in the salience of cultural issues versus economic issues may drive entry under the right conditions. I will show them to you. And then we will go on to show how such entries may reshape policy via the formation of coalitions. And finally, we'll show how the bargaining power of entrants may drive the policies that they can extract in this process of forming coalitions. Of course, this is going to be related to a bunch of work. I don't have time for a detailed review, but let me just mention, obviously, this relates to long-standing work on electoral competition, going back to Downs. I already mentioned the large political science and political sociology literature on new parties. There is a key paper by Austin Smith and Banks from many years ago now that is known as the German paper in the colloquial language. And they do model elections and government formation in the same framework, but they take the parties as given, namely 3 parties, and they have only one political dimension. So we add to that. There's a small political economics literature on party entry. And those of you who will see through the simple argument that I make will see that there would be some room for incumbent strategies, for example, to deter entry, as in the IO work by Jean and others, or to constrain policy, as it happens in political economics. I'll return to that point at the end. They will model government formation, thinking about that as a legislative bargaining problem, a post-election politics problem. So we draw a lot on the insights from that literature. And then, of course, the notion that new political cleavages arise over time and are associated with new parties is the insight of Seymour Lipset and Stein Rokkan in their famous paper from the 60s. So here is my plan. I want to start by showing you some key patterns in the data so that we know what kind of phenomena we want to explain. Then I'll go into the modeling, first showing this setting with only 2 parties, study party entry. By that time, we'll have some empirical implementations. I'll return to the data and give you a few provisional results at least, and then I'll be out of time. So we look at data that is consistent. It comes from an organization known as PALGov. So we have data for 30 plus European countries for about 45 years. And during that time period, center-left and center-right parties held 86% of the seats in the legislatures of these countries. But gradually, things changed. So I'm going to show you some data on the entry of green and radical right parties. So we'll divide parties into these 4 families: center-right, center-left, green, radical right. Then I'll show you how these parties score on the 2 dimensions I mentioned, left to right, and cultural conservative versus liberal. We'll take a look at the government coalitions that have formed that involved either a green party or a radical right party. And finally, I'll show you some correlations of entry and the stringency of regulations on environment and immigration. So this map shows the extent of the data set. So a pink entry is a country which only has center-right and center-left parties. This is now in 1980, a snapshot of the situation there. You see some green countries, not very imaginatively. Those are the ones that have a green party present. Then maroon is to have only a radical right party, and the striped ones have both a green party and a radical right party. By 2020, 30 years later, the situation has obviously changed. There are fewer pink places where there are only mainstream parties, and in fact, the majority of countries have both a green party and a radical right party by this time. So that reflects a history of entry over time. So this is a timeline where the histogram shows how many new entrants were in a particular election year. And you see some early entrants in in the early part of the period, then a wave of green entry in the latter half of the 80s, and then after the financial crisis, there's a particular wave of radical right entry in the most recent years. You can score these parties on these two political dimensions. So this is the Chapel Hill expert survey scores, where national experts score every party that is represented in parliament. On the left to right scale, that's the x-axis, and then on the Galton axis, that's the y-axis, and we have normalized them to lie between -10 and 10. Now I marked these 4 party families. So this is the European coloring of center left and center right. So the red ones are the center left, the blue ones are the center right. You can see they are polarized in the expected way, but not very polarized, sort of in between -5 and 5. And then on the cultural dimension, they are not so polarized at all, quite comparable scores on that. The green parties, the green dots represent green parties, 1 dot per country, and then the maroon ones, as before, will be the radical right parties. And here you see that the Greens tend to lean left on economic issues. The radical right parties lean right on economic issues, but they are very polarized on the cultural dimension. In fact, that is not only true for parties, it's true for individuals. If you ask people in surveys about their stance on various policies, then you'll find that the people who say that they like to regulate the environment, they don't want to regulate migration so much, and vice versa. So there is this particular polarization that we'll try to capture very simply in our model. This is the same map, but now plotting all the coalitions in this data set, where a green party has entered in coalition with another mainstream party. And one might perhaps expect that most coalitions would be on the left. That's not true. More than 60% of the coalitions are with center-right parties, as these lines show. And the definition of a coalition here is the center-left, center-right party is the party of the prime minister, and then the definition of a coalition is that at least one ministerial post is held by this green or radical right party. Here are the coalitions involving the radical right. In this case, it is perhaps more as expected that there is more often coalitions between radical right and center-right. That's 2/3 of the coalitions. Not as many coalitions in this case, but it seems to happen at a higher rate the further we get. And then finally, I do a very simple exercise to look at the correlations in the data. So, this is a simple difference in difference estimate of where we run regulation stringency on party entry, compare before and after entry, because we have country and year fixed effects. And what this shows is that whenever a green party is present, as opposed to not, then environmental regulations are stronger by some 10% on the scale that we are using for that, whether we hold constant radical right being there or not. And in the third and fourth column, you see there's an analogous result for radical right being present. Then stringency of immigration restrictions are stronger by about 20% on the index that we are using. Okay, so this is some of the facts that we hope our model will speak to. So let me now get to the formal setting. It's going to be a simple model, very simple, in fact. There will be some symbols and equations. I apologize for that. I'll try to keep the intuition alive as I go through this. So clearly, we want to model some economic and cultural heterogeneity. And the simple way we do that is to assume that each citizen will have two types, an economic type and the cultural type. So think about the first one as a class dimension and the second one as this cultural dimension. So to keep things simple, we'll just assume that some individuals are poor, they have a labor income that is lower than the average, and the rich, they have, by definition, then an income higher than the average. We call them L and R for left wing and right wing. And Y is the overall mean of income. To introduce this polarization in the cultural dimension in a simple way, we assume there are three cultural types. So there's G types, those are the GAL types, the green, alternative, liberal. There are T for TAM, traditional, authoritarian, national, and then N for neutral, who don't have a particular preference in any direction. We assume that there are fixed shares of these groups in society, and with those shares we can do accounting as we like. We can compute the share of people who are green. We can compute the income, average income of people who are green, etc., etc. So now let me introduce the policy instruments that I announced before. So there will be two forms of regulation. Regulation of the environment that runs from 0 to 1. 1 means stronger, or the strongest possible regulation of pollution environment. And then there is regulation of migration or trade, which also runs between 0 and 1. 1 again being a strong regulation of migration. So both of these are going to affect the cultural payoffs that people have. They think about these regulations as intrinsically good, given their views. But then also there is an economic cost of introducing regulations. So each income group bears a marginal economic cost for regulation, which we label by R. In the redistributive domain, there is one form of redistribution, which is very classical, an income tax that is used to pay uniform lump sum transfers to the population. So that's very predictable, Meltzer-Richards type modeling for those of you who know the jargon. So then, next thing we do is to write down the policy preferences of people. So take someone who has class K, rich or poor, and cultural type J, neutral or GAL or TAM. And for simplicity, we make preferences linear. So the first term that you see, that's just the economic redistributive payoff for a member of the rich or the poor group. And then the second term is the cultural payoff for someone who has cultural type J of regulations imposed. But from that cultural payoff, we have to deduct the regulation cost and the indirect redistribution that it imposes. So this is a little bit complicated notation. I apologize. I'll try to explain. So we have a couple of parameters that will play, at least one of them will play a role in the analysis. So by C, we mean the cultural salience of conflict over that particular type of regulation. So take the green group and look at their preferences of a green regulation. So they'll have a positive payoff of regulating the environment. But the nationalist group, traditional group, will have a negative payoff of regulating the environment. So this is the polarization that I alluded to. So if C is bigger, then the salience of these green issues are bigger, but they are bigger both on the positive side and the negative side, and vice versa for immigration regulation. So each culturally polarized groups love their own type of regulation, but they hate the other type of regulation. And the degree of love and hate is captured by the salience parameter C. Then the neutrals, they don't have any cultural payoff, they just bear the costs, so they don't like regulations at all. So now this linearity makes life very easy. It drives the bliss point of the groups to different corners. So for redistribution, the high income type prefer the lowest possible tax rate, and will set the lower limit on the tax rate, T lower bar. Whereas the the low income group will like to have it as high as possible, and the high income group will like to have it as low as possible. So the income tax is bracketed between T lower bar and T upper bar. That's true for all cultural groups. Then for regulation, the implications of what I said on the previous slide is that the green groups and the traditional groups prefer the strictest possible environmental or regulation or migration regulation, given that the cultural salience is large enough to exceed its costs. And then, as I also said, neutral groups always want the laxest regulation of both forms. So that's the sort of the types, their preferences, and the implications of what they would like to happen. Now, how is politics played out? There are two incumbent political parties to start with. We think about one of them as center-left, one of them as center-right. So they are organized along economic left-to-right dimension. And we just label them left and right as the groups. How do the parties form their preferences that they act upon in the political competition? We assume that parties are policy motivated, and are policy motivated via their members. So the center-right and the center-left, the membership is made up completely of people from group K, i.e. rich or poor, and the culturally neutral people, perhaps mimicking a bit the dots that you saw in the colorful diagram on the two axes. So then the preferences of party members in those two groups will be like the equation in the middle of the slide. The first redistributive policy is like the class that they represent. And then the second are the preferences over the two forms of regulations. But those uppercase deltas, they are going to be negative because they only bear the costs, see no cultural benefit of regulating. Does that mean that they never pursue anything by assumption? No, because they need to get elected, and if they get elected, they get to pursue their redistributive policy. So if parties may still want to regulate from tactical reasons, if the electoral returns are high enough from doing so. So how is policy set? We assume that the parties offer policy platforms for the three policies, the two forms of regulation and the tax rate to the voters. They cannot commit themselves to these promises, so platforms must be exposed credible, and this is achieved by picking a type composition of the candidates who will have the right exposed incentives to pursue whatever you have promised. So on the redistributive policy, we make life simple for ourselves by saying that these guys can only recruit candidates of their own type. So the rich can only run rich candidates, and the poor can only run poor candidates. So they may only offer credibly the bliss points for taxes. This is just to remove one dimension of policy from the analysis. In regulatory policy, however, they can recruit candidates of any cultural type, so they in principle can offer any regulations that they want. I haven't said anything about voting behavior, and purposefully we try to keep voting behavior very general, so we just assume a reduced form. Parties will always choose their favorite tax policy, so their win probabilities, PK for party K, will just reflect their stance on the regulatory policies, and of course they sum to 1, those probabilities. Now, we do give some micro foundations for this also, so there's an appendix that uses our dear friend, the probabilistic voting model, as a kind of running example, and introduce parametric distributions of both voter-specific and aggregate shocks, so as to make the election outcome stochastic from the viewpoint of the parties. So political game is very simple. The parties offer these credible platforms, voting shocks are realized, everyone votes, and then the winner implements the policy that they promised, and you go down. So we begin by studying in Nash equilibrium, incredible policies, with the usual definition. So here's a benchmark equilibrium that may very well happen. We're interested in the situation where political equilibrium is passive on regulation, namely no regulation of the migration, no regulation of the environment. When does that happen? It happens when the condition in the proposition is being fulfilled and is being implemented by each mainstream party, just fielding their own types of candidates in the economic dimension and neutral people in the cultural dimension. And it's very simple intuition. If you imagine you're such a party, should I deviate from this proposed policy? Then I have to consider that the possibility that I will have to pay the cost, that's the delta. With what probability do I incur the cost? With the probability of winning at the stated equilibrium. So that's a negative term. But then I have the redistributive benefit of winning, that's the ZK. And then I can change my probability of winning by appealing to the voters. I don't know which sign that has, but if it has a positive sign and it is a large number, so votes are very elastic in promised redistribution, then it might conceivably overtake the negative regulation cost. But unless parties are very polarized on redistribution or aggregate votes respond a lot, then you will have an equilibrium without any regulation. So how should we interpret this kind of benchmark? So we think about it as, ongoing political competition happens every now and then. There's an election. There's a sequence of static equilibria like the one I just showed you in Proposition 1. No party offers any form of regulation, but voting shocks shift policies between higher taxes and lower taxes depending on whether the right or left wins. Arguably, these results capture the heydays of traditional left to right policies, and the proposition also kind of show how policy might sidestep the interests of the cultural groups G and T. Of course, there may be shocks, and we'll be interested in shocks. We have a companion paper where we just focus on a two-party system and ask when will the two-party system adjust and introduce this cultural dimension as a salient part. that may or may not happen, because if cultural issues become more salient, then both the lovers and the haters are more think more about it. But from the viewpoint of getting votes by appealing to regulation, they kind of net out. So if you make one group happy, you make another group unhappy, and you may not gain all that much. So in the companion paper, we show that adaptation of the parties to such shocks may require shifts of leaders or members of the major parties for them to adapt. But that's not the paper I'm talking about now. In this setting, we are interested in shocks as sowing the seeds for party entry. So, for example, environmental issues turn more salient. CG, if you remember, goes up. And if the mainstream parties will not respond, the Green group may have a strong motives to form a party and enter. Now, when we introduce such salience shocks, as we will do, we will assume, to simplify, that they are MIT shocks in macroeconomic jargon, i.e. they are unexpected, in particular, and they are permanent, and they are unexpected when the previous period's policy was set. So incumbents cannot deter entry by adapting policy beforehand because they don't know that the shock will happen. It comes as a total surprise. Obviously, this is simplification and room for extensions. So now let me get to the logic of party entry. So we're interested under the conditions where a new Green Party or a new radical right party runs in the election. And we'll consider two types of entry. One is what we call strategic entry. You enter to become the third largest party and potentially influence policy. Then we also study what we call backlash entry, which is a reaction to regulation shifts after mainstream parties may have changed or another party may have entered, and that we think applies particularly to radical right parties. So why would we expect at the very basic intuitive level that party entry would enter equilibrium policies? Well, think about any political equilibrium is going to be some type of political compromise between different interests. That's except in an autocracy with a one-man rule, right? And policy is going to be set in a different fashion in after entry and before entry. Suppose it's before entry and there are only two parties. Then each party is going to trade off the interest of its members because it acts on their behalf against the possibility of influencing the electorate at large. So that's the trade-off that they are looking at. But if there has been entry and there is not a single party majority, there's going to be a government formation process where two parties bargain about what to do. And then involved in that bargaining are the two parties, and each party represents its members. And that's a different political compromise than the one we'll see in the two-party equilibrium. And that's really the main insight here. Okay, so consider an entrant party, a green or a radical right party. It's going to entail both economic types, both poor and rich people. We assume that they form a kind of Gaussian coalition and act in order to enhance the average member's preferences. So they will have a preference function such as this. So the average member will have an average income, which may or may not exceed average income. And in one case, then it will lean left. In the other case, it will lean right. And then it will have preferences over regulation, depending on which group it is. And it's easy to see that for regulation to be altered after entry, then there is a simple necessary condition, which are given in the second equation. So cultural salience of your own regulation, so to speak, if you're green, the environmental regulation has to outweigh the indirect cost of that regulation. That's a necessary condition. And so we'll think about salient shifts that increase the cultural salience of regulation as the main driver of party entry. So then there'll be a political game that is played, which is, first thing that happens, there's a latent entry by the Green or the radical right. They choose whether to enter or not. There's an election with voting shocks, gives vote shares and seat shares. But now, if no party wins a majority, then the parties try to form a government via government formation, and we'll model that as a form of legislative bargaining. And here is the protocol that we use for bargaining. It's a simple protocol, but it takes clear inspiration for how things are done in most countries. So think about first the status quo policy, which is the policy that was decided in the previous period, in this sequence of games that are being played. Now there's going to be a largest party in the legislature. It gets the task from the king or the speaker of parliament or whoever it is to make a proposal to form a government. And that's going to be a policy triple that the largest party proposes, hoping to collect a majority. If it is accepted by a majority, then it's implemented and formation ends. If it's rejected, now it's an open thing. The second largest party may propose a second round proposal with some probability, 1 minus SE, but the entrant may also have a possibility to propose a policy in the second round, and we call that probability SE then. If this is accepted by a majority, it becomes policy. If not, you go to the status quo and implement that. So this is the simple government bargaining game. So here is the rub of the matter when it comes to the incentives in that bargaining game. There is a scope for policy compromise. What is that? Well, suppose the entrant party is large enough to form a majority with party K. So together they will have more than 50% of the seats. Now, since this entrant policy has a positional redistribution, which is in between the two class-based parties, it can offer a concession on tax rates, on redistribution. It's not so costly for it as it would be for the mainstream parties, but it would demand a concession on the regulation that it wants. And that's the scope for bargaining along those lines. On top of that, there may be some influence of the entrant party to the extent that it can make proposals in the second attempt. So the logic of political entry is very simple. We just compare payoffs to the prospective entrant, under no entry and under entry. And whether the no entry payoff is below the entry payoff hinges on two circumstances. One is what we call an electoral disruption. So your entry into the electoral process is going to reshuffle votes. And in particular, the probability that the mainstream right or the mainstream left will win a majority of its own will change and possibly go down, or most probably go down, because you must steal your votes from someone if you enter. And secondly, if you have also proposal power, then you may shift policy in your own favor, as we'll soon see. So I'll show the logic in a very specific example, but an example I think that has real-world interest, given what you saw in the motivating facts. So let's assume we have a green entrant, that's the most common entrant, and that green entrant leans left, i.e. it prefers the high tax to the low tax. Let's further assume that the left won the election in the previous period, which means that the status quo outcome is the high tax. And thirdly, let's assume that the left is also the largest party this period, and thus will make the proposal in the first round. That's the protocol of bargaining that we did. So if we reach the second round, the green will have to bargain with the right. And as always, we will resolve this from backwards. So here is the situation in that second round bargaining. So if you look at the dotted lines, they form a kind of Edgeworth box, right? And on the tax axis, so to speak, the feasible policies are between the lower bound and the upper bound of taxes. That's T lower bar and T upper bar. And on the vertical axis, the feasible policies is regulation between 0 and 1, right? Now, the status quo point, by assumption, is the high tax, and it's going to be 0 regulation because that's what you had in the previous period in this sequence of non-entry equilibria. Now let's think about the mainstream right. It has a bliss point at 0 regulation and the low tax rate. It has indifference curves that sort of curve around that point. That's how it looks like. And then for the Green Party that has entered, it has a bliss point at maximal environmental regulation, and it leans left, so it has a bliss point at the higher tax rate. And it has indifference curves around that point. But now, let's assume that it's the right wing party that calls the shots, makes the proposal. What is it going to do? It's going to offer the status quo payoff to the Green Party, so on the indifference curve that goes through that point. And then it's that's going to be a good tax rate for the right in exchange for some regulation to the Green Party. But now suppose the Green Party would call the shots. Then the roles are reversed, and the Greens can do better because now they can make a take it or leave it offer. So they are going to keep now the right-wing party at its status quo payoff and move closer to its own bliss point with a higher regulation and a higher tax rate, right? So these are the two possible outcomes. Now, form an expected value of those two outcomes with the probabilities of being recognized, and you'll define an expected round 2 payoff. And that round 2 payoff will become like a participation constraint in round 1, where now the left party, the biggest party, is making the proposal. And it can offer, as long as it offers that participation constraint, the Green will accept, and that's the equilibrium that we get. Proposition 2 sorts out all the possible cases. This was just an example. So the main result is going to be that a left-leaning Green Party always enters for low enough entry cost if a condition on election probabilities is fulfilled. What's that condition? It's that the probability that the right wins an own majority is lower after entry than it was before entry. Why does that make sense? Because this is the tax policy that the Greens hate because they are leaning left. So if the probability of that being implemented, which happens with an own majority, goes down, then that's good for entry. And then with a large enough salience shift, the green may enter even if that condition is not fulfilled, if it has the prerogative of making proposals in the second round. So even though there would be a negative disruption, then this is a compensatory factor. So does this condition hold in a plausible electoral model? That's where we turn next. And we show that under very plausible conditions on voter behavior, this condition on election probabilities is very likely fulfilled. In particular, it holds whenever the entry of the Greens diminish the vote share of both the mainstream right and the mainstream left. And we show that in the specific case and the microfounded case in the appendix. Now, there could be radical right entry as well. Basically, the conditions for a right-leaning radical right party to enter are analogous to those for a left-leaning Green party to enter. And Proposition 4 in the paper spells that out. However, many entries of the radical right, as you saw, came pretty late on the timeline, and they happened when, after a shift to more environmental regulation that happened over time. That environmental regulation might have been the result of a shift in the preferences of mainstream parties, or it might have been the result of a previous entry of a Green party. So now, does the radical right party enter to sort of create a backlash on environmental regulation, since this is the stuff that they hate? We show in 2 propositions in the paper that this can happen for either of 2 reasons. After, if there are just the large mainstream parties that have changed their mind, then after a radical right entry, one of them can find a more convenient tax policy in the same way as we discussed earlier. Or if the shift towards green policies reflected the earlier entry of a Green party, then one of the mainstream parties can find a more convenient coalition partner. And in both cases, the Green policy is going to be rolled back. Okay, so I'm running out of time. Let me still get back to the data and tell you a little bit of what we have done so far. So the model has 3 clear-cut predictions. So the first one is that salience shocks can drive entry. Second one is that entries might drive policy via coalition formation. And the third one is that the bargaining powers of entrants, this probability of calling the shots in the second round, can drive the policy surplus that entrant can extract. So how should we test them? Let me suggest a few empirical strategies to estimate more causal relations with the same European panel data that we looked at initially. Okay, so do salience shock drive entry? And here we're going to, perhaps somewhat unexpectedly, exploit the 1986 Chernobyl disaster. As you may recall, this is the biggest nuclear disaster that has ever hit humanity, classified as the gravest one, followed by Fukushima decades later. And we're going to exploit that, and we're going to compare the responses in states that did versus did not produce nuclear power at the time. So, of course, this is sort of predicated on the history that Green parties were basically anti-nuclear parties in the beginning, born out of social movements against nuclear power and demonstrations that happened in many countries. So we're going to estimate a simple static difference in difference regression. We're going to run green entry on a dummy for this being the first post-Chernobyl election times whether you have or do not have an active nuclear reactor, at least one, at the end of 1985, and then we just run the regression on the slide here. So intuitively, the treatment effect here, the gamma, is identified from a within-country response in the treated group, those that have nuclear power. I mean, the green voters in the control group, they are going to see the same exogenous shock, time-wise, foreign disaster, but arguably the domestic risks that are perceived and get people upset are going to be less salient because you don't have nuclear production yourself. So this is what we get. So that dummy, the treatment dummy, does increase the presence of green parties by maybe 20% relative to the sample mean, even more if you count the number of green parties at the time when this happened. And this holds true whether we control for lagged green party presence or not. And with a placebo, there's no effect of a radical right party being present as the dependent variable. So we think this is promising. It's very simple. It's very few observations, but still the data want to speak. We think one can do better work, like make a dose and response difference in difference by looking at the number of reactors per million people, say, so that would be a greater threat. One can perhaps do something similar but more involved with migration salience. Here we may exploit that to estimate the radical right entry. So this would be a shift share strategy where we look at sending country shifts of political refugees. 2015, many people come from Syria. Many people go from Syria to Germany or Sweden because they were there before, and that gives us a shift share way of instrumenting for that migration salience. The second question, do party entries drive policy, is also intricate to do. We would really want sort of a random entry to happen for some reason, and we would check whether those random entries affected policy in the expected direction. So the closest we have our ideas has brought us in that dimension is to exploit national thresholds for representation. So some countries in Europe have such national thresholds. You may know that the party needs 5% at the national level to get represented in Germany. Sweden, they need 4%. In Denmark, it needs 3%, etc. So we're going to do an RDD around regression discontinuity designed around those national thresholds. So we're going to have collected data on what the national thresholds are, the vote shares and the seat shares of new parties that do and do not pass the thresholds. So it's going to be, as an empirical strategy, we're going to run a first stage regression discontinuity where we run a dummy for having a positive seat share on a running variable, which is just the vote share minus the threshold. So you exceed it or not, plus or minus. And then we're going to run a second stage or a reduced form, the effect of having that seat share jump at the discontinuity on environment or immigration regulation. And we're going to hold two-way fixed effects constant. So this just shows that the first stage is very clean. It's a sharp regression discontinuity at the threshold at 0. So this looks like a clean intervention. When we do this reduced form, we don't find anything significant when it comes to green entries. But for radical right parties, we do. So here you see the binned scatter plot of residualized immigration restrictions on the y-axis, and you see the running variable on the x-axis. And the point estimate that when we run the appropriate regression has an increase in residualized immigration restrictions by about 15% at the p-value of 5%. We have little data, but they seemingly want to speak. In further work, we may try to use a more full two-stage approach, use the actual seat shares rather than a dummy for being represented and their effects on regulation policy. We may try sort of the more modern staggered event study design, and we may, instead of looking at policy, we may look at influence as having the salient ministry, in this case, immigration minister for the radical right and environmental minister for the Greens. I don't have time for the third check, but let me jump that, and let me go to the final remarks. So what have I offered you? I've offered you a formal framework to study party entry. It is motivated by the data, the radical rights and the Greens that we've seen entering over the last few decades. The central insight, as I already said, is that before entry in a two-party or two-party family system, these parties or party families set policy unilaterally, trading off the interests of their members against the electorate at large. Whereas after entry, the focus of policy setting is moved to government formation, and where two parties are bargaining with each other, trading off the interest of their respective members. And that results in a different policy. It's not earth-shattering, but still worth saying. So we use this framework to show how salience shifts may drive party entry, how party entry may drive policy via coalition formation, and how entrant bargaining power matters for how much infringements you get. And we can use the equilibrium of this framework to interpret real-world events, but we can also, as I tried to demonstrate, guide the empirics on entries, coalitions, and parties. So theory ahead of measurement, if you like. Now, there are many extensions one can do. I did make this assumption about MIT shocks, so there was no anticipation of entry. What happens if mainstream parties anticipate the entry of a new party? There are various things they could do. They could agree not to include the new party in coalitions. That's what happened with the cordon sanitaire in France. That's what happened with excluding the AfD in Germany. Successful so far. It happened in Sweden with the so-called January agreement, but that was sadly forgotten. So one question is, when are such agreements credible? When are they not? Another thing that incumbent parties may do is to adjust current policy to reshape future policy outcomes and thereby try to sort of take the incentives out of entry. And a more sort of severe infringements might be to reduce the bargaining powers of the expected entrants by changing the protocol for government formation, giving the mainstream party an undue advantage. There are empirical extensions. I think there are scope for alternative empirical designs. One reason is that this kind of small country panel is unavoidably going to run into power issues. Another is that these reduced forms that I've been showing you so far, they don't really fully capture the equilibrium interactions that are pretty complex in this model. So two ways forward. One is to increase the amount of data. You can go to the same country and look at the party that enters. That typically happens sequentially in local elections in municipalities, say, over time, And our model will give predictions about the order in which you would enter in those particular municipalities. And of course, the other way forward would be a more structural approach where policy and entry are jointly determined. So, last point, this paper is a first step. It's just the first step, but we may be biased, but we think it suggests an important direction of travel. So I think that more theoretical and empirical research should follow. Thank you.